Good afternoon. It is 26 minutes past 5 on Saturday afternoon, and today I'm going to read out chapter 2 of my book. So here we go. Awoken by the sound of shrill birds on the sill outside, Elspeth rubbed her bewildered, squinting eyes. She hadn't remembered falling asleep, but reasoned it was plausible from the chaotic night. Graham was moulded to a green plastic chair, his head slumped on the bed and his mouth gaped open like a stuffed animal at a museum. She would not wake him yet. Discreetly, she slid out of the sheets, still warm from the night's slumber, and began walking down the bright tunnelled corridor. She always thought it ironic how hospital corridors were so filled with light, like the supposed light you're drawn to on the journey up to heaven. Following the giddy maze of arrows and annotations which plastered the hospital walls like maps on the tube, she found herself peering through smeary, checkered glass. Inside, rows of incubators lined up like egg boxes in a supermarket, each with its own squirming bundle within. Pink blankets for girls, blue for boys, and a clipboard at the foot of each bed with notes of identification. How hard could this be? She thought to herself as she eased the great lumbering door forward. Sliding across the rubbery tiles, it creaked and groaned like an old stock sound from a Hitchcock film. "May I help you?" A concerned voice and small, warm hand on Elspeth's shoulder alerted her that she was not alone. She span round and in an instant, clocked the kind but eagle-eyed nurse keeping watch over the newborns. Elspeth had always trusted people with blue eyes, but she thought they seemed more nurturing, purer, and a stark contrast to her deep-set, rust-flecked pair. Her hand loosened its grip on the brass-patterned doorknob, and she scuttled backwards with a mild smile. "Just stretching my legs and getting some fresh air. We've had a long night." "No problem. You take your time, dear." And with that, the nurse shuffled back up the corridor, with all her pins and badges clanking on her polyester uniform. A few visitors passed, and the man in the navy robe wheeled himself up to the coffee machine. A young Asian family was issued into a room, and Elspeth despaired as the father cradled his face in his hands. The door was firmly shut, but the window was ajar and the blinds half closed. From their actions, she could tell the news was sombre. Feeling rather intrusive, she turned back to the glass and began wandering back down the corridor. The scent of bleach and sound of tinny hospital bed wheels jutting across the lacquered floor was reassuring and dulling all at once. She longed to be back home choosing colour schemes for the nursery and pureeing food for the baby in a blender. As she drifted, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in an overly polished window and what seemed to be a collective silhouette of a chain of nurses marching into a room. She followed them with intrigue and stood numbly as they presented themselves before Graham, who was now sat bolt upright like a secretary in his green plastic chair. There were 4 of them in total, of varying heights and widths, 3 brunettes and 1 blonde, and none of them with those trusting blue eyes. He nodded and fiddled with his arms, changing them from crossing over to clasping his hands. He looked unusually uncomfortable and swayed a bit like he was on a ship. His blinking was slow and heavy, and each time he opened his mouth to speak, he was cut off by one of the rapid-speaking nurses. Before anyone caught sight of her, Elspeth shunted up against a wall and pretended to immerse herself in an anti-smoking campaign poster. She'd never smoked in her life, but her eyes locked on the words and pictures so intense it was like a magic eye. She figured the nurses would file out again before long, and would rather hear the facts from her husband than a gaggle of old medics. When the room was theirs again, Graham ushered her over to the window. A flutter of charcoal wings cautioned them back from the ledge as the full-bodied crow descended on the city below. His lips parted as he drew an apathetic breath. There were further complications. And I'm going to go on and just read chapter 3 now, because it's quite a short one. So, chapter 3. Swilling the brush in the cloudy water, George stretched back to admire his work. The world may have been black and white to him, but his outlook was always colourful. On the chalk, eroding cliff tops that separated his house from the sea, he'd sit and paint for hours on end. Of course, to the untrained eye, the shapes and landscapes that lay on the canvas was always assume a familiar theme. Fluid clouds, a cascading lake, and a few trees dotted in between with great thick trunks like chimneys. Unbeknown to him, the colours were almost spot on: moss green leaves, an azure blue sky, and milky cream reflections which gave the paintings a three-dimensional sense. With time and patience, he had learned the different intensities of the shadows, and with an astute eye could easily distinguish his cherry reds from his scarlets. How he did this was simple and comical all at once. On Sunday afternoons, he and his wife Olive would browse the local DIY shops, not for home furnishings. They'd take to the paint aisles. Reels of colour swatches were up for grabs here, accessible and easy to cart away with no weekend sales assistants any the wiser. Blues, greens, yellows, reds, cool colours, warm colours, complementary colours, you name them, they took them. A wall in George's study was dedicated to them. The walls have eyes, not ears, he'd joke as he sat with his horn-rimmed reading glasses sloping off his nose. Occasionally, Olive would bring him some Earl Grey, maybe a few beef and horseradish sandwiches, but for the most part she left him to it, knowing full well he was a man with a plan. Olive was a sweet-natured woman, and with wild, untamed auburn hair that never seemed to behave itself in any kind of weather. Humid or desert dry, it would wire up and flare out like wood shavings, meaning it usually found itself tied back so she could get on with the gardening. She'd pander to her flowers, the pansies, lobelias and foxgloves, and call them her babies, which was fitting since she had no children of her own. Graham's mother had passed away when he was a young lad, leaving Olive to act as his second parent. There were never any cross words between the three of them, since they all had tolerant, almost passive temperaments. Their demeanour was simple, black and white. Life had its ups and downs, but if you settle somewhere in the middle, you'll always stay grounded. It was the seesaw effect, or so George would call it. What goes up has got to come crashing down, son, he'd say as Graham was growing up. Don't get on that seesaw unless you're prepared to fall. It was this straight talking that got Graham through the tough times when he longed for his mother's presence. From the day he scored his first goal for the football team to the day he married his college sweetheart, Elspeth Rose. The cloudy water shook from the vibrations on the ground. Old George's phone was buried amongst some moss clumps and angled brushes, ringing loud as a parade, yet he was in a world of his own. Some people find it hard to switch off from their surroundings, complaining about noise pollution or stress, but not George. He often had to pinch himself to see whether he was really awake, as he was so accustomed to falling into this dreamlike state. The call went straight to voicemail, and on the other end of the line, a frenzied Graham left an urgent message. Dad, it's me. We need you to come to the hospital. It's about your dichromatism and we need you to come now. People here have limited scope on it, and you've lived with it for 73 years. Don't call me back. Just get here as soon as you can. Ta-da! And that's chapter 2 and 3 of my book. And hopefully chapter 4 will be coming up shortly. Okay, stay tuned.